So just a little housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded. We will post a link to the recording on the webinar page of our website as soon as it is available. At the end of the webinar, I will put the link in the chat so you all can have access to it later on. It should be up this afternoon. To ensure a high quality recording, all attendees are encouraged to mute your mic. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in the Zoom control panel. If we have time at the end, we will address them. If not, you will be able to contact our presenters for any further questions. So let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. Regina, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Regina Romeo. I'm the Chief Human Resources Officer for CPS HR Consulting, and I'm also our DEI program leader. So I do our mental health webinar every year. So I'm back again this year to celebrate Mental Health Awareness Month with my other panelists. So Dr. Tyler, if you want to introduce yourself.
Thank you. So I'm Tyler Arguello. I'm a longtime clinical social worker. I have a small private practice, but my other day job is I'm the chair or the director of the social work program at Sacramento State in Sacramento, California. So thanks for having me.
Great, and last but not least, we have Amanda Gibson.
Good morning. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker and a longtime colleague and friend of Tyler. So we always love having these conversations together. I run the Counseling CoLab in Sacramento, California, and that is a private practice with other clinicians. We are doing counseling online and in person in Sacramento throughout the state of California. And I'm a clinical professor at Sac State as well, and help out in the DEI team at CPSHR doing workshops on emotional intelligence.
All right, thank you all. So we're just going to jump in and get started. This is an open discussion, so feel free to add to the conversation as needed. So first question is, what are we seeing in terms of the HR side going into the third year of the pandemic in the workplace?
A lot. So when the pandemic first started, it's so weird to talk about the pandemic like in its third year already. We all had to quickly pivot to a remote work type if able to do that. So a lot of people who were essential workers weren't able to, go home and work. So our remote workers were facing all kinds of things. It's the separation from the workplace, it's the isolation, it's not just the work, but also not knowing what's happening with school, with how long this was going to last. I remember we, often joke about, hey, 6 weeks to flatten the curve, and then it would just be over. But as we have navigated the last 3 years, it's become increasingly difficult for a lot of people because now we're into the conversation about the return to work and the stress and anxiety that comes from spending the last 2 years putting your protocols together of how you're going to manage your day, how are you going to manage your family, how are you going to manage work within your remote workspace. And now what we have to deal with the return to work. So some people are very excited to go back into the workplace and, hey, I get to see everybody. And, we get to socialize differently and really connect in person. But there's also a lot of other things that come with the people who are like, I'm really comfortable at home. I was doing fine right here. So being available to manage how everybody's not on, super excited about coming back. And then there are people who are super excited about staying home, and then everything in between. So from the HR perspective, it's really just trying to help our leadership and try and help our organization come up with good plans for how we can invite everyone back into the workplace, manage those hybrid models where people are working partly at home during the week and then partly in the office during the week, and making sure that we're making good business decisions that are in the best interest of the organization and of the employee. So if you have situations where it makes sense for an employee to still work remotely, whatever percentage of time, 100% or 50% or whatever the situation is, that we're keeping our minds open and allowing that, because a lot of my colleagues work for organizations where it's like, no, we're just going 100% back into the workplace. And that's causing a lot of unrest in the workplace. And they're seeing a lot of people leave their workplace for other opportunities. So being mindful of what the bigger picture is and what people are dealing with, that it's not just work stuff that we're dealing with right now, but also a lot of the other mental health aspects that come along with the roller coaster that we've all been on for the last 3 years. So I don't know if Dr. Tyler or Amanda want to add into what they're seeing as well on the return to work side.
Yeah, Amanda, you want to go?
You go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. You know, in my position, again, so whereas I see clients still in clinical capacity and do ongoing or brief therapy, you know, also in my role as chair of the director of a department, you know, I have faculty sort of quote unquote under me, or that I'm responsible to in various ways. And so actually my work touches on sort of interfacing with HR, right, and large bureaucratic systems. And so I guess dovetailing a little bit about what Regina said, you know, one of the things that I'm finding in my capacity of like trying to support my colleagues in their pursuits of being able to balance their work is, and I trust that this is not anything new for you all HR professionals, but you know, the weird situation of people having their life affected and they believe possibly that there may be a need for an accommodation, but the word accommodation in an HR sense means something very different than in the colloquial sense, which also means something very different in the you know, disability community or disability space sense, which also means something different in the academic classroom space. So accommodation, where I found that's sort of almost overused word, and in supporting my colleagues to just sort of, yes, let's advocate for everything that you need. I've run up against that sort of our policies, and I'm just going to speak only from my experience, our policies in our institution, so HR-wise or otherwise, in some ways, whereas they want to, you know, support faculty or staff or students, when it comes to this new world of balancing COVID in all the levels, but sort of health, mental health specifically, the policies sort of really lag behind what the reality is. And so I've found actually a number of my faculty and staff say, after a while of trying to get some sort of accommodation, this isn't stuff like, I need a sit-stand desk, or I need to have XYZ, like all these material things. It's more just like, how can I better balance this, right? So whether it's working at home or whatever, they've just sort of abandoned any of those conversations because they're just like, it's too much paperwork. My physician or whoever other prescriber or whatever medical person, they're not going to sign all the things that the institution needs. And so they've been really caught. And so I've been in this precarious position of, you know, trying to support them emotionally, administratively. So that's, for me, just something I keep seeing over and over, right? That the balance with the workplace is very difficult and tricky. I've erred on the side, just as administrator, to be as open and inclusive as possible. So that's, for good or for bad, what I've been doing. On the clinical side of things, sort of whether it's, you know, kind of the things I'm seeing, I guess, on a clinical level here in my department, or really just with the clients, it's not just even the questions come up about how do I go back to socializing, professionalizing, and there is, sure, absolutely a level of like social anxiety, and I say that kind of in air quotes, like clinically diagnosable and just colloquially diagnosable, that social anxiety is coming up, and figuring out the strategies where people feel the capacity to go do these things that they may want to do, that it just feels so unfamiliar. But also there is a real, you know, a real issue that has been emerging of, I was just talking with a client last week, as the world is opening up and as systems are going back to maybe believing that COVID just is completely over, people running up against real problems with basic needs, which is beating the same drum that we've been talking about over the pandemic, but now it's in ways, for example, the conversation was, his building's being sold, his rent is now going up by $700, right? And that's not unique to Sacramento, right? I mean, I've been hearing just friends and colleagues across the country that those sorts of things are happening. So there's been a shift a bit beyond just typical kind of clinical mental health conversations happening in therapy, there now is the emergence of more and more attention to, like, as we'd say, like case management, basic needs, basic resources that are becoming almost taking center stage.
Thank you, Tyler. I would say having similar conversations in my office. And one thing I think that's helpful to explore as a leader, if you are tasked with making some of these decisions, and especially if you're at an organization or the top leader has the mentality of, let's go back 100%. I have some leaders that I work with as their therapist or a coach, getting them to really explore and articulate why they feel that way. What are the emotions underneath that? And seeing if they can explore that and process it maybe on that individual level in therapy. But if it really is, for example, with one leader I'm working with, it's about a value that she has around connection in a workplace and some other things that she uncovered. And my task to her was to work a little bit on vulnerability in leadership and share that with her team, why she feels so strongly about wanting more people to come back in. I don't think that the organizations that are being inflexible or the leaders that are being inflexible are going to be very successful, but they may be able to move the needle a little bit if they're sharing on a vulnerable level. Why is it important to them? Why is it important to the organization? And then seeing if you can get some buy-in from there and some alignment around the values. I think then we're talking more in the language of DEI a little bit too there, where we're looking at how do I have a sense of belonging and inclusion in the organization when you're asking me to do this, but I might have barriers like basic needs or my mental health. I have these new symptoms or a worsening condition because of the pandemic. How can I still feel like I fit in and belong in the organization and bring up that I have these needs or would like to advocate for some more flexibility in my schedule?
I think that's kind of a key point, Amanda, is the flexibility, because none of us have been through anything that we're experiencing right now. So I think as leaders, there's that pressure to have all the answers. And it's like, well, is the answer everybody's back in the office? And really, that's not it either, but maintaining that open mind about what the possibilities are, having those candid conversations with the rest of your leadership team and the rest of the organization, because there are some people who are, ready to come right back into the workplace, no problem. But even before the pandemic, we were already dealing with people who struggle to be a part of the organization or felt like they didn't belong. So definitely seeing a lot of that exacerbated during the pandemic when people are feeling even more isolated because we're in that virtual workspace. So being open, I think, is key to having these conversations and not feeling like there's one answer that's going to be for all time. 90 days from now, 6 months from now, you might have to have a different conversation. You might have to have a different conversation a year from now, but that's what we do, in order to really be supportive of our folks in the workplace. So thank you, Marissa, for the question.
Absolutely. We have a comment in the chat from Crystal real quick. I'll just read it. Crystal says, working in social services, we are seeing this from both ends, from the customers and public we serve, as well as our staff. So incredibly grateful for our organization leadership efforts towards our return to workplace process. Thankfully, some of the tools we put into place will help us manage future problems like bad weather, PSPS events, and etc. So we'll move on to our next question. How can we recognize the signs of someone that is experiencing stress, anxiety, burnout, and etc., things of those sorts?
I'll let Dr. Tyler start to answer that one first.
Sure. Yeah, no, and I trust that, Amanda, and I can riff off of each other a bit. So a couple things that really I think may sound obvious, but I think are really important to underscore. And I guess maybe a little bit of the hesitation you hear in my voice is one thing that really happened in the pandemic, obviously, is people being so connected to social media And whereas there's a lot of helpful things that can happen through being connected online, I, as a clinical professional, I get very concerned with the simultaneous rise of credible sources proliferating on social media to offer mental health support, offer some frameworks to better understand mental health and strategies to promote wellness. And then the group of folks who capitalize off of social media in very unhelpful ways. And because they're on social media, they become automatically in people's minds like a credible source, and they're not. So by that, with that, I would say, especially in the workplace, when we see drastic changes in people's behavior, whether it's emotionally, psychologically, interpersonally, in their work performance, productivity, those are things that may sound obvious, like, wait, what's going on? But they really can sometimes equal a temporary shift in someone's sort of kind of overall well-being, but also they can really be an indicator that something maybe deeper is going on. So keeping in mind that it's not just a one-time event that signals a major problem, but if we think about if we're seeing a change that endures over time, that really is unusual and not typical to the person's general kind of disposition as we've understood them. I think things like being a quick trigger, so unprovoked anger and hostility. And sometimes that can come across in ways that are very microaggressive, so little snide remarks, or being passive aggressive, which in my experience is just people being aggressive, maybe in a more passive context, sure. Or also people who are maybe not having the unprovoked anger or hostility, but people who are maybe kind of taking up a lot of time and space in the room. So people who are lingering too much in your office, people who are lingering too much, kind of droning on and on and on, and possibly like with what appear to be really inappropriate disclosures in the workplace. Like someone hasn't already talked about their personal life before, but suddenly they're kind of ruminating on things from that part of their life. I think also people having sort of these moments of kind of not being able to, so they may have, some people may have like unprovoked anger, but also people who really can't kind of get over things like they used to if they're ruminating like with their reaction to like the boss has come down with some new edicts, whether it's you have to come back 100% or whatever the change may be in the work schedule, and someone just really like has it under their claw and they just kind of can't get over it, and it becomes like this excessive prolonged reaction. And I think there's also always sort of physical indicators, right? So is someone showing up, and granted, we all are dealing with the issue, and we all kind of, it's tongue in cheek, but I mean, whereas people may kind of have some extra COVID weight, okay, fine. But beyond that, like, is someone coming and they are just sort of disheveled, and they typically aren't, right? Or are they coming, I mean, frankly, are they coming in and you can smell alcohol in their breath, or some other indicator, like, they're coming in high with pot or on pot. And so, if people recognize signs like bloodshot eyes, for example, or if in general, people are coming in and there's like a fogginess about them, right? Almost like disoriented, right? Not really, it's not even just not present, but like maybe can't schedule themselves, can't follow through on deadlines, just kind of generally seem out of it. So those are kind of some first run indicators that I would be looking for.
And I think I would add to that, yes, to all of that, and add to a perspective that what I'm seeing a lot in my office, in my conversations too, in even in more of the consulting world, that sometimes people are holding it together well enough to be at work, and they may not be having the behaviors that Tyler just described to their coworkers, but they may be having it with their family members, and opening up and talking about that they might be, snappy and irritable with a partner, but then, they can come in and turn on the camera and like be on. I've been hearing a lot of people describing that disconnection between how they're showing up and they feeling that pressure to keep performing at work, but having more dysfunction maybe in interpersonal relationships. That may be a little harder to uncover in the workplace, but people may be opening up and sharing those subtle things. I just did a employee wellness webinar discussion at a private company, and we talked openly about that and gave some space to discuss like when maybe things are a little bit out of balance. And really, I think that a lot of people are needing to look at their time management and boundaries between work, self, and relationships, because there can be so much bleeding over between roles and not having time to transition, especially if you are still remote working, to transition between this is my work self, and then I have my 15 or 20-minute commute and I listen to music, or I talk to a friend and I walk in the door and I'm show up in a different way as a mom or a dad or a partner, to give themselves those transitional times. And looking at the scheduling too, and what we're expecting of employees in terms of how much they're supposed to be on or available, that they are encouraged to schedule breaks and take breaks, that we stop the meetings running over into the next meeting and we're all running late and we're panicking because we're showing up late to the next Zoom meeting or the session if you're a therapist. And that we buffer, we in the therapy world, we have 50-minute sessions. So we have 10 minutes in case something runs over, so we can get up and stretch. We can use the restroom. We can attend to our human needs. Because a lot of the fatigue and exhaustion that you'll see as a true indicator of a burnout symptom can be from the lack of movement, because you're sitting so much and you're in front of a screen so much. And that is a real point of physical exhaustion for people, when it feels very draining to be on screen, be on camera so much. Another part to burnout too is whether it's real or perceived, but this feeling of like diminished productivity. You'll hear employees start talking about that, like, I can't seem to get stuff done, or they're more hypercritical of themselves. They don't feel like they're accomplishing as much, even if they are. And then another real indication of, are we dealing with more than just a episodic mental health episode, but a burnout episode, or full burnout where someone might need to take a leave of absence, is a depersonalization or a disconnection from self, kind of being on autopilot, feeling robotic, and maybe not gaining as much joy or pleasure out of work or meaning that they might have derived before. There's a really good book on burnout that came out during the pandemic, and there's a few really good podcasts from the Nagoski sisters. It's called Burnout: Understanding the Stress Response Cycle. Highly recommend that book, and we can maybe talk further about what that means as a way to manage stress better, especially in the continued uncertainty, because as humans, we hate uncertainty, and we're continuing to have to live in it.
We like to know what's happening. And I think from, thinking about the workplace and thinking about how we show up, it is so different in the virtual space, because you really just need to be ready from the waist up. The rest of your life, the rest of your body, that can look like whatever. So it's difficult sometimes to see those signs. But I think, an important point to remember is that we're all going through this right now. So we're all going to experience a downturn. So it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is fully, like Dr. Tyler was saying, if it's episodic or if it's something that's ongoing. And that's what we need to be mindful of. It's like, you looked a little off last week, it's like, hey, you know what? I bounce back, and then you get to see the person as you're used to seeing them. But to be mindful of what it means, because people say that people snap, and I don't believe that people ever snap. I think they slowly unravel. So there's always some signs of people kind of getting closer and closer to that edge. So I think as coworkers, as colleagues, as like Amanda was saying, at home, as mothers and fathers and partners and neighbors, to just be mindful. It's just kind of like, this has been going on for a little while. What type of response should I have to this person? What type of outreach? Or should I just ask, are you okay? Is there anything that I can do? But also keeping in mind that you need to recognize those things in yourself. Like, I know when I'm getting a little too chippy, a little too, where it's just like, I need to maybe I need to sign off for the day. But those signs are always there. It's just a matter of whether or not we're going to pick up and kind of receive that messaging that people are sending us. So thank you again, Marissa, for the question.
Of course, thank you all for your contribution to the question. In the chat, we have a couple ways that people deal with this. Carlos says they've had great success with one-on-ones, although weekly meetings would be a bit intense for larger groups.
Mhm.
And then Shawana says during team meetings, schedule a weekend wrap-up meeting with your staff to create an open, stress-free forum for staff to discuss any issues they may be experiencing as it relates to mental health issues. It's a good suggestion. And then we'll move on to our next question. So kind of just to pile on the last question, what are some coping strategies for burnout and stress and anxiety and all the other ailments people have been experiencing at this time?
One of the things that I've started to suggest is having people block their calendars, because what happens is, like what Amanda is saying, where it's just like, when people see that you have an hour, then it's like, oh, I could get on our calendar. And now we have an hour. And it's like, not really. That was going to be the time that I was going to, I don't know, exhale for 5 minutes, or have a little break within the day for myself. So putting some time on your calendar, because that's really the only way to detach for a few minutes, because people will jump right on and say, oh, well, I need to talk to you about this, call or send you an email. It's like, oh, okay, well, let me get on your calendar. And then you're stuck in another meeting. So keep in mind that there needs to be some time management in there that you take control of, because everything is a pressing need. Nobody's trying to get into a meeting with you because they have something that could wait or that's not a priority. Everybody feels like, we need to talk about this right now. The other thing that I would say is look at how much time you are devoting to a meeting. So if you schedule something, whether it needs an hour or not. So I've gotten to be a fan of the 15-minute meeting, where I'm not even calling them meetings, I'm calling them check-ins, because if we can get to the point of what we're talking about in 15 minutes or in 20 minutes or in something less than an hour, I'm here for it, because there's this feeling like, okay, well, now I have an hour, so I need to fill up this time. And it's like, no, we could have talked about this probably in 15 or 20 minutes. And then if we have to have a follow-up, that's fine. But once you agree to or assign yourself that hour, people are going to load up that hour. So just be mindful of how you're spending your time as a strategy, because everybody's trying to get the same amount of things done, but it's really, again, getting back to that focused energy, where it's like, what do we really need to talk about within this meeting so that it can be productive and it can be useful, but then it doesn't make you feel so burdened and stressed out because you're going to back all day, and then you're in meetings all day, but you're not really getting what you need done completed.
Yeah, I guess a couple things that I think about. Sure, I think at face value, probably Amanda and I wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't say maybe one of your coping strategies could be using, having yourself or your colleagues use your EAP benefits, or just general mental health or other health insurance benefits, right? So I think that's helpful, sure. On a practical level, day to day, something, things are more accessible. There's a couple things I think about. One is my classic line that I wish I was the originator of this phrase, but I say all the time, where's the fire, right? Like, it kind of to Regina's point, like when things are feeling so intense, like at work, feeling like you need to respond to, whether it's that email or you need to respond to whatever new policy changes happen, or you need to respond to whatever meeting, or at home, to Amanda's point, right? Balancing the other stuff. Right? Like you feel like you need to have that argument with your kid or your partner or whatever, or your neighbor, like where is the fire, right? Because our body is telling us something is emergent, urgent, what have you. Our reaction doesn't have to be in kind to that urgency, right? Because we have to really figure out like, where is the crisis? And so it may be more important to think about our body or our brain is telling us there's a crisis, but what really is that crisis? You know, to one of Amanda's earlier points, like, is the crisis really something deeper? Like we're actually in a very vulnerable position right now. And so the response isn't to externalize and rail against someone, but rather actually what we need to do is, you know, on the other side of things, take care of ourselves. And so I won't say that one of the strategies is self-care, because I think too quickly we jump to like bubble baths or whatever. But
A yoga retreat.
I do think that self-care in my world is, especially under the context of like right now, with all these very amorphous things happening around policies and laws and, you know, violence against communities. And I mean, that's not amorphous, but it's out disarticulated maybe from our immediate world, and we're just seeing it or hearing it on social media or the news. I think self-care absolutely can equal, sure, the things we take care of for ourselves in our immediate space, but also going out and doing things outside of ourselves, whether that's protesting at some sort of, you know, space out like at the Capitol, or, you know, doing things, you know, advocacy related to the communities that we're networked into. So showing up at, whether it's school board or showing up at our neighborhood association or showing up at other community groups, like doing things outside of what's in between our ears to be part of the world around us, I think is super important, especially when it comes to those of us who suffer with depression, anxiety, which sort of tricks us into thinking only in terms of our internal self, right? So getting outside of ourselves is super important. And then I think one of the other things, you know, and then I'll hand it off to Amanda, is just the idea of being really gentle with ourselves about the ways in which we've, over the past 2 years, either consciously or unconsciously become accustomed to kind of our manners of consumption. And so some of you may have come to understand that people around you have consumed more than usual, whether it's food, alcohol, other drugs, you know, in a financial sense, buying a bunch of stuff. Like, we do these things, right? We consume things for lots of really good reasons that are often deeper than just what's at face value. And so what I'm getting at is understanding the ways in which we have been consuming as a coping strategy. And I think we're in a space now that we can kind of, believe it or not, this sounds really weird, take a note from the smoking playbook, even though smoking is not very common anymore. But when I've worked with people around smoking cessation, or, you know, truth be told, when I've done smoking cessation on myself, you know, what do we talk about? If we can identify that we're having an urge to do something like consume or smoke, if we give it 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 7 minutes, what do we know about humans? We're not that complicated. The urge comes in, the urge peaks, the urge goes out. And so it's not going to solve everything. I'm not saying this is a silver bullet for anything, but rather that process of giving ourselves some space before engaging in behavior is super important, so we can see we don't have to only do the one urge. We don't have to only smoke. We don't have to only drink. We don't have to only buy something else on Amazon, right? Like, we can give ourselves some space to think about there might be other things we want to do, right? So being strategic about our consumption.
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Tyler, because that's often those behaviors that can sometimes cause self-harm are the ones that can land us with sort of behaviors that might show up at work that create a concern. And as this relates to the stress response cycle from the book Burnout by the Nagoski sisters, they talk a lot about completing the stress cycle. And so often those behaviors that you were just describing are the ones that we go to because we want to feel better. We want a chemical shift in our brain, that you get a very immediate calming effect from any of those things, and some really great chemicals that get released that shift and change your emotional and mental state rather quickly. And especially when coming home from work or transitioning out of the home office back into the home. And if we have a lot of stress in our bodies, we are just almost like fiending to get rid of it, or externalize it, extinguish it. But often those behaviors numb us out or give us a place to avoid the emotions of like, wow, that was really crappy today when I showed up at work and my boss didn't even ask how I was, when they know that we just, had another a mass shooting this weekend. Nobody talked to me about it. And it feels really crappy that I had to just go on and be a robot and not show my human side. So just putting in the chat really quickly some of the strategies from the book to complete the stress response cycle. And the thing I would add to this is that being aware of that reptilian side of your brain of flight, fight, or freeze, and matching your stress response activity to, so if you felt some rage because somebody said something to you at work, you're having a fight response, that one of your strategies is letting your body go through what it would be like, not that, avoiding workplace violence, you can't go and punch your coworker, right? There'd be consequences to that, but maybe there's literal rage in your fists that you need to get out. So you go to a kickboxing class or you pound some drums, whatever it is, so that your body is getting to discharge and externalize the stress response. And then that course I was teaching in the private company last week, I challenged everyone, instead of asking their family or friends, how was your day? Ask, did you complete your stress response cycle today?
Okay.
Shifting that.
Dr. Tyler mentioned Amazon, and I'm like, guilty. I think also thinking about what we're all experiencing right now is we're dealing with the pandemic, obviously, and everything that comes along with that. But the other things that we have to deal with haven't gone anywhere either. So if you were already dealing with, taking care of your aging parents, or you have a condition that you're dealing with, or your mortgage is, getting out of control, or your rent's getting out of control, or you haven't been able to go on a vacation, or any of the other stressors that are going to exist for all time. Now we're still dealing with all of those things in addition to, so we're way past, like Dr. Tyler said, the bubble bath stage, where it's just like, oh, we'll just, check out for a few minutes or whatever, but really start to be more mindful of your behaviors and how you're showing up and responding to a lot of these things, because kind of akin to what Dr. Tyler says, I always say it's HR, not ER, so anything that we have to deal with is going to be fine, so if you have to not go to that meeting or delegate a task or be unavailable for certain parts of the day, let that be okay. Because a lot of times there's a lot of guilt. It's like, oh, I really wanted to be, in this meeting, or people are like, you're taking a day off, and there's like some shame involved. And that's like, I need a moment, okay, and be okay with saying that and expressing that to people, because that's how you do your best to try to combat some of these things that are coming at all of us all day, every day. So thank you, Marissa, for the question.
Sure, thanks again. We have about 20 minutes left, and I have a couple more questions. So next is, how does someone ask for help and seek resources when they know they need it? And then to pile onto that one, how can we be supportive for those who are not looking for resources to cope?
I'm sorry, you cut out for a second. Can you repeat the second part of the second question?
How can we be supportive for those who are not looking for resources to cope?
Okay. I would say what I see in the workplace a lot of times is like what I just mentioned. There's still a lot of, shame or guilt about really just taking care of yourself. I don't know why there's this expectation that we're designed to be on all the time, like we're supposed to be on 10 all day, every day. And showing up looks different every day. Sometimes I am on 10, some days I'm on 3, but I'm here, so being able to still create space for people and to leave room for people to not be on 10 every single day, but understand that people are doing their best, and extending that grace for people the same way that you would want it extended for you if you were going through a tough time. So like I said, the pandemic, obviously it's its own animal, but if you're dealing with, your bills are late, you're dealing with, child custody, you're dealing with a domestic situation or whatever, that's present as well. So that combination of everything and the not knowing, like Amanda was saying about not knowing what's next, it's like, okay, well, we just got the mask mandate lifted, but are we going to have to go back? Are we going to be in whatever code yellow or whatever, the different colors and stages are? So not being able to anticipate what comes next is a stressor on its own. So I think being graceful in those moments, and when people are saying, you know what, I'm not going to be able to do this, or I need a day off or a week off or whatever, that we're like, okay, that's okay, because we're all going through it. So when you need those resources, obviously we have EAP and other things that are more, let's say, formal, but that self-care is really important, and self-care is different for everybody. It's something that you want to incorporate into your day, and whether that's having it sounds, so basic, but having like, your favorite tea, or, putting on your favorite coat, or even just sitting around, what I like to do with my favorite, little blanket for a little while and just kind of reconnect with yourself, because then it's not about anybody else. Like, I'm not a yoga person, I don't know that I could quiet my mind down enough to meditate for any long period of time, but do something that's meditative. So these are my emotional support shoes that you see behind me. Those are real. So I built that shoe rack during the pandemic because I like a lot of DIY. So if I could take a couple of days to, I'm going to Home Depot and then I'm putting things together, and then I get, that takes me away from some of the other stressors that are in my face all the time. If I found that that was not working, then I would definitely, continue to reach out to professionals, in hopes that people aren't going to feel like, oh, she's going to therapy or whatever. It's like, we're all in therapy right now. We're all in some kind of therapy, whether you're building a shoe rack or you're actually going to a doctor's office, it's still therapy.
Yeah, I guess sort of dovetailing that a bit, in this idea, this question, right? The idea of like disclosing to people or trying to be of support to people. I guess one of the ways I'm sort of conceptualizing this is the idea of, how to have hard conversations, right? And in my world, I think, I know that I often talk a lot with, whether it's my clients or whether it's students or whether it's colleagues too, about, not to fear the hard conversations, but to engage with the hard conversations, because if we aren't having some level of discomfort, we oftentimes aren't doing a lot of change or growth, right? So discomfort doesn't have to signal that something's really bad, right? Discomfort can actually be something activating and helpful, and a positive sign that change may be underway or is happening. So with that, I guess in sort of seeking out support, one of the things I think is really helpful is maybe changing some language around. It's less about, and this comes up in a lot of my work with folks who are marginalized by their gender or sexuality. It's not about really coming out. I mean, coming out in a sense can be important, but really it's more about thinking through about inviting people into what's really true and authentic to you. And that has a lot to do with how sort of accurate are we about who we're inviting into what's true for us. And by that, I mean, it can be a lot to expect. And not that any of us in this room have done it, but if you have a partner or you're dating someone, right? Like, how much do we put like this 100% onus on this other person to be everything for us, right? And I say that, in all my imperfection too, right? I mean, I've done it several times, right? But I mean, that's a little tongue in cheek to get to the point of like, have we diversified our network of support? Are we really accurate about truly being honest with ourselves of, Amanda, she's great for all these conversations over here that are really hard. And I know, she can be my ride or die person when like I'm down and out. But the person next door, literally in my office, who's my office manager, I'm not going to go to her with the same things that I would go to Amanda with, because not that she can't handle it, it's just we don't have that kind of relationship, nor should we, right? So being really accurate about who we're inviting in, and being careful about, in some ways, right, like inappropriately asking people to do things for us that really are just not in that sphere, right? Because that can sort of set us up for ultimately like failing ourselves, which is not to criticize anyone, but just sometimes we kind of mindlessly go to people at that water cooler and it's like, wait a second, that our coworker isn't the best person to invite into this conversation. Related to that though too is, have we done a really good job about, in many ways, consenting people into a conversation, right? So I know in the world of clinical stuff, like if you work in an agency, and Amanda and I have worked in agencies before together, and sometimes we can have like a really intense conversation with a client. And I can imagine in your spaces, you're having a really intense meeting with one of your staff, and then you need to kind of, to Amanda's point earlier, like discharge some stress or emotion. And so we go to the water cooler and we just start brain barfing, right? And it's understandable that like we need to get things off our chest, but we have to be really clear about, everyone, as we know, is dealing with something. And so have we consented the other person into a conversation? And, just to, I know this is sort of a clinical example, but the idea of like thinking through like, hey, Regina, something intense just happened. Do you have a moment to talk about this, right? Or would you be willing to, later on this afternoon for 15 minutes, could I speak with you about something big that happened today? Or I go home to my partner and like, I had a really hard day, right? I just wanted you to know that. And so if I'm a little off, you'll know that it was a really hard day. And you know what, I can't talk about it right now, but maybe later on this evening, or maybe tomorrow morning when we're having breakfast, like, could we, share some time and just talk through something, right? So thinking about really not just, again, inviting people in, but really getting their consent to have large conversations, right? That are really sensitive in nature. And then, the last thing I'll say is just that idea of like wanting to be of support to people who may or may not want your support or who may or may not be ready. I mean, I think one thing is just being very careful in, sort of crass language, but, being careful of the sort of save a hoe mentality, right? You can't make people do anything. And also too, we have to be very careful. And so this gets back to some of my original comment about like getting a little tired with these like social media stars who talk about mental health, but have no training, right? And so you can't be everything for everyone. And it's not your job to be someone's therapist. It's not your job to be someone's parent, unless you actually are the parent. And so, be careful about believing that you're going to be Florence Nightingale, or in the world of social work, Jane Addams is looked at as like the founder of our discipline. Like, you're not that person. And everyone, as much as they're living their own experience and they're the expert of their own experience, everyone has a variety of supports that you don't even know about. And even if they don't, one thing that can be really helpful is, reflect what's true for you. Again, hey, Amanda, I know we don't know each other really well, but, it just seemed like in that meeting, maybe something's going on for you. And I just wanted you to know, like, I see you. And if you want to talk, I'm here for you. Right? Because the key to that is letting people know, not that you can like solve their problem, but letting people know that you witness them and you're validating them as someone just important in the world, right? Frankly, that's super helpful, right? People want to be seen, right? And then, if you really feel like you need to go there, the reality is like, hey, you could just, talk with HR and say, hey, HR person, can you, maybe have you reached out to this person to give them some materials? Probably you have already, but like, you can kind of go to the appropriate person that may be more appropriate to intervene with resources, right?
All right, thank you all. So I have one more question, but we only have 10 more minutes. Do you guys want to take this question, or would you like to open it in the chat?
You can ask, and then we can maybe give you like a little quick rundown, and then we can do the
Okay.
chat questions as well.
All right, so last question I have is how can we normalize conversations around mental health and seek proper assistance?
I think Dr. Tyler just touched a lot on what that was, it's really the frame. You don't want to just pass somebody casually in the hall and then oh my gosh, I was just trying to go to the ladies' room and then they just unloaded on you about, everything that just went on with them for the last, little while. But normalizing those conversations means that you're coming into the conversation with the intent of just being there to support. You're not there to judge, you're not there to solve, you're not there to be like, oh, well, what you need to do is blah, blah, blah. Because I read online, last night that if you're having this, this, and this, and you should do this, this, and this, because even within the experiences that I have as an HR professional that, Dr. Tyler and Amanda have as clinicians, everybody's situation is different. So even if you're diagnosed with something from, let's say, a large umbrella, how you experience that and how that shows up for you is going to be completely different from person to person. So normalizing those conversations is having those conversations when they're comfortable, when you're not already on, you're with high emotion, and it's like, let me just I call it decompressing, take that virtual commute, because you're shutting your computer down, you're going into the living room, you're sitting with your blanket for a few minutes, you're getting your mind right and letting a little moment pass, and then you're trying to have that conversation. Because if you've ever talked to anybody, it's like when you get in a car accident and you're trying to talk to people at the scene and you're involved in it. I don't even remember, half of the things that I said. The next day when I have to explain that to my insurance company, it's like, here's what I remember happening. So allowing yourself that time and not feeling like you need to run at everything all the time to put that fire out or act like you're in the emergency room, and just taking that pause, I think, is how we, can have those conversations in a way that are going to be productive for people.
And I would just add, in terms of normalizing the conversations around mental health, I think partnering with community organizations or providers to come in and get, talk about these things, or you passing the information along, surveying employees to find out what are the topics that they'd want to learn more about, to bring the mental health conversation to the workplace in the form of, lunch and learn webinars, gatherings around that, and then incorporating and modeling the self-care throughout the workday as part of your work culture, I think is incredibly important. In some ways, I think being a social worker and running social service organizations over the years, there's a little bit more openness sometimes to have those conversations around incorporating self-care at work. And so when I've been a leader in a social service organization, we would have retreats or meetings and talk about exactly what self-care looks like. And I have like the self-care plan that I'll have people fill out, and they're open to sharing that. Then we kind of know for each other, like Regina's go-to thing is her blanket. And maybe she's venting to me and I'm noticing that, and I can just say, did you take a break today? You seem overwhelmed. The best thing to do is just to do nothing for 15 minutes and be with your blanket. And that you kind of know what those go-to things are for people. So you're getting to know them. You can support it really nicely throughout the workday, and what those go-to things are, because everybody is different and we can learn from one another when we share what those tools are. And then I think we're creating more of like a sense of community care in the workplace, that this is part of what we do, where we all are practicing these things. And then having, in addition to the educational courses, to have open forums or spaces where people can come to get support, or do a mindfulness exercise, or debrief about something, whatever it is that it's, so when something critical happens, that, okay, we need to initiate having, a Friday afternoon debrief, that it's just part of what we do. It's like any other procedure or policy that our workplace has these available tools and resources. And you'd be surprised how many people like Tyler and I could come into your organization and lead one of these workshops, or getting the mental health 101 first aid training for employees so that we can recognize these things for each other. People are really open to this information and want to work somewhere where they feel cared about and valued.
Great, thank you. So that wraps up the questions that we have for you. In the chat, there's a couple things that came up. I will get to them regarding EAP service. Like, do you have any tips to promote those? And then the next one is, how do you do that when the employee feels like if they take a break, they will be judged harshly for it? So how do you encourage breaks if you think they will be judged harshly for it? I think that's your question, Joanna. So while you think about those, I'm just gonna address everybody that the session is recorded. I'm going to post the link to it before we end the webinar here. I'll do that right now. And if either of you, Amanda, Regina, Dr. Tyler, if you want to post your contact information, just in case we go over time and people want to contact you in the chat, that would be great. Anything else?
And I would say with the EAP question, your EAP program should have outreach sort of department that can come in and talk about how to utilize the services. But I've also seen some organizations that have partnered more on the local level. So for example, the Counseling CoLab, we have an engagement with a private company where we did like a mental health check-in series where the company paid for 2 sessions with one of our therapists just to see how the heck are you doing, kind of like a wellness checkup, like you'd go to the doctor. And then either they could choose to stay with that clinician and pay for it with their health savings account, or they could work with that therapist to identify the type of therapist that they might need from their EAP or their health insurance benefit. So that was a really powerful, I think we saw about 25% of employees utilizing mental health services from that project. And there's a lot of places that would partner with you on that. And then with that last question, I would say that I would look at workplace culture and look at what's going on in the culture that people might feel judged if they take time off. Because oftentimes it's because everybody else is doing it. With my social work students, I'll tell them to watch the social workers at their field placement and what they do at their lunch break. And if people are actually taking lunch breaks, because those students will see those older, more senior social workers not eating. So then they think that they don't need to take a lunch break. So it's modeling that the behavior, it's coming from somewhere, someone sending messages that it's not okay to take time off. And you can track that if you have an initiative around employee wellness. Some places don't utilize their PTO at the level that they should, and they have too much PTO. And you can start to normalize, like, we take mental health days. You don't even have to call it that. You don't have to say why you're taking time off. We want you to recognize the signs of stress and burnout, schedule a day off versus getting physically ill from stress, and then you're out.
You're forced to be ill.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And I think that's a really, key point, because eating at your desk or eating in your car or whatever is not balance. Your breaks are built in to the day for that balance. And like I was saying, your body is not designed to just be on 10 all day. So having those as part of what people are actually seeing, they're seeing you walk outside, they're seeing you take that break. They're seeing you not just go all day or even be online all day. Then it's like, oh, okay, so it is okay for me to take some time off, because I have several employees who have exorbitant amounts of vacation time because they never take time off. There's nothing, the good news is nobody wants to do your work while you're gone. So whatever work you're doing is going to be right here when you get back. So I always encourage everyone to take that time, because that's why you're given that time, not to stockpile it, not to, well, I gotta do this and I gotta do that, because there's always going to be some have to in the workplace. But balancing that with, I do need an extra day. Memorial Day is coming up. You get that Monday off, take that Tuesday as well, to ramp back up. And let that be a part of what is normal for you, and what you're modeling for the people around you, whether you have superiors or subordinate staff or whomever, that becomes normalized.
All right. we've hit our time, so I think we're gonna wrap up now. So thank you everyone for attending. We appreciate you being here. Thank you, Dr. Tyler Aguelo, Amanda Gibson, and Regina Romeo for being with us here today. Again, the link to the recording is in the chat, also the contact information of our presenters as well. And that's all we have for you today. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you guys.
Have a great one.
Thanks. Take care of yourselves. Thanks.
Bye.